Sometimes naming a child can be a complicated proposition, or at least it can sometimes not go as planned. I remember about 30 years ago, I hate to admit it's been that long, but it's true, about 30 years ago, the first of my friends to have children were having their first child. And of course, those were the days when ultrasounds were not routinely done in order to determine a child's gender. So you had to wait 9 months to find out what the baby was, which I always thought was sort of fun, kind of increased the suspense of the situation. So my friends made 2 lists of names, and there were the girls' names and the boys' names, and then they narrowed it down to the perfect boy's name and the perfect girl's name. And so, of course, we all knew what the baby was going to be called. Well, I'll remember June 1st, I really don't remember exactly what year, 1980 or 79, 80, 81, around there sometime. Must have been before 81. My friend David, the husband, came to my house and said, "We have a girl." Oh, how exciting! But he left before he, mentioned the child's name, which I thought I knew. So I went out and bought a little outfit for the baby, got a card and wrote the baby's name on the card. Went to the hospital and was surprised to learn that the child had a name that was entirely different than what we thought the name was going to be. Completely, a never before mentioned name, as far as I was concerned. And the story is that they held the child in their arms and they looked down at her and they said, "She's not I don't even remember what the name was. She's not a Tiffany." And instead they named her Tracy. She was a Tracy Lynn, and is a Tracy Lynn. See, that's how it can go when it comes to names. But Mary and Joseph didn't have that problem. Don't think about these mundane things with Mary and Joseph. They didn't even get to choose their own child's name. They knew they were going to have a boy, and they knew that he would be named Jesus. And I don't suppose you routinely argue with angelic beings, no matter what the baby looks like. I don't imagine they looked at him and said, "Oh, I don't know, he doesn't look like a Jesus. Let's call him Moses instead." Instead, they had his name. And so, 8 days after he was born, as was the tradition, they went to the temple in Jerusalem to have him circumcised. And when a boy was circumcised, the name was then publicly announced, and he would be called Jesus. In Hebrew, Yeshua, or a form of Joshua. And the name means either God saves or He will save. Now the thing we have to understand is that in Hebrew thought, the name was closely connected to a person's essence, a person's even existence. A person was not considered to be fully human until he or she had been given a name. And the name represented the person's destiny, the person's personality, the person's, as I said, essence. And so the naming of a child was very, very important. It was important to the family, but it was important to the whole community because there is power in the name. So how much more would that be the case of a child who has been named, in essence, by God? A child who has been called God saves, or He will save. A child who, by angelic beings, has been called Lord and has been called Messiah. It's no wonder that Mary, we are told, pondered all these things in her heart. She must have thought, what does it mean that this baby, you've all held, probably most of you have held an 8-day-old baby. What does it mean as I look down at this little tiny child, that he will be the one who saves, the King, the Lord? Maybe she had in her mind the King David, the baby's ancestor way back. The great King David, a powerful and wise king. Maybe she thought, this Jesus of mine, this Yeshua, he will become a king like David, wise and powerful. He will restore Israel to its homeland, kick out the enemies. He will make worship of Yahweh the priority. That's how he will be king. It was far too soon for her to realize the rather upside down way that Jesus would assert his power. Many years later, the Apostle Paul describes that surprising way in a hymn that we read as our first lesson. It's actually a poem or a hymn about Jesus. And Paul is speaking to the church in Philippi, and he wants them to understand this astounding reality about this one whose name is Jesus. And so he says that he, although he was equal with God, now think about that, although he was one with God, although he deserved the glory of God, he did not exploit that power, which implies that he could have, doesn't it? He did not exploit that power, but instead he became humble to the point of becoming fully human. And he not only became fully human when he entered humanity's realm. He didn't enter among the rich and powerful, but he was born in a barn, as I like to say. He was born in a barn among humble, poor parents. One commentator says that in essence, Jesus was on this downward spiral. He left perfection to enter the realm of imperfection, even to the point of suffering and dying on a cross. And so Paul says, because of all that, the name of Jesus is the name above all names, the name at which all of creation, I said this morning in the sanctuary, can you imagine the poinsettias bowing? The name at which all of creation bows. That he is the one whose name has true power. There is power in his name. And as his followers, if we are to imitate him, we must imitate his humility. We must count others as more important than ourselves. We must set aside our own desires and our own needs for the sake of people around us, the Apostle Paul says. We must be willing to be humble, to not seek status or power, and we must be able to serve, be willing to serve in radical ways. It was because Jesus did these things that he lived up to his name, the one who saves. And when we do these things, we live up to our name, which is Christian. The problem is, what's the problem? Just so hard to do. I mean, all these are sort of beautiful platitudes, but it's just so hard to do. It's so hard to be humble, to put other people's needs ahead of our own, to serve in radical ways, to not seek status or power. It's just so hard to do. And so, perhaps what we need to do more often than we do is call on the name of Jesus.